I hope everybody's doing well. Just one more second. All right. Okay, so I think we're all set. You see people filing into the room as normal. Please, everyone, turn off your cell phones and find a seat. Good evening. Welcome to the New York Studio School's virtual evening lecture series. Tonight is my great pleasure to be introducing and presenting Bob Thompson's Life and Legacy, Adrienne Child's Naudline Pierre, and Diana Tuite. Before we begin, I would like to just quickly thank our panelists for taking the time out to be here. And I would like to thank all of you in the audience for joining us this evening. It's going to be a great talk. I would also like to quickly recognize that the New York Studio School Evening Lecture Series is generously supported in part by public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council, the Robert Lehman Foundation, and the National Endowment for the Arts. I'd like to thank all of those organizations, as well as the many individual contributors that help keep the program free and open to all. And if at all you would like to, please consider making a donation either during or after tonight's talk by clicking on the support button on our homepage at www.nyss.org. And thanks again, we're extremely grateful. I would also like to, before I introduce our speakers, just point out at the bottom of your screen, you'll see the Q&A button. Feel free to enter in a question at any point during tonight's talk, and we'll leave time afterwards to ask our panelists. Of course, we'll have the time afterwards, so you can put in questions then as well. Okay. I would like, so tonight's talk is about Bob Thompson, and it's in conjunction with the exhibition that's on view right now at the Colby Museum of Art in Waterville, Maine. Bob Thompson, This House Is Mine. That's through January 9th, 2022. And the show will travel to Chicago, Atlanta, and Los Angeles. There's a wonderful catalog for the book, and there's great images on the website at the Colby Museum of Art, which I recommend everyone check out. Our first panelist is Diana Tuite. She is the Katz Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art at the Colby College Museum of Art, where she has been instrumental in building an expansive collection and developing new interpretive strategies and curatorial models. In addition to Bob Thompson, This House Is Mine, recent curatorial projects include Hugh Locke, Here's the Thing, and Turquoise Dyson, Nautical Dusk. Our second panelist is Adrienne Childs. She's an art historian and curator. She is an adjunct curator at the Phillips Collection and associate of the W.E.B. Bois Research Institute at the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research at Harvard University. She curated the exhibition Riffs and Relations, African American Artists in the European Modernist Tradition in 2020 at the Phillips Collection. And her current book project is Ornamental Blackness, The Black Figure in European Decorative Arts, forthcoming from Yale University Press. And finally, our last panelist is Naudline Pierre. She lives and works in Brooklyn, here in New York. Her paintings draw from fantasy and iconography to conjure a mysterious alternate world full of characters that often interact in tender ways. Naudline received her M.F.A. from the New York Academy of Art and a B.F.A. from Andrews University. This year, very recently, on October 23rd, she's part of a show at Prospect.5 in New Orleans, which is on view through January. And she also she has a major exhibition on right now at the Dallas Museum of Art. Naudline Pierre, What Could Be Has Not Yet Appeared, which is on view through May of 2022. So I hope you're able to see. her shows, as well as the Bob Thompson show that we're all here for. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming our panelist, Bob Thompson's Life and Legacy.
Thank you so much, Sam. If you wouldn't mind putting the first slide up, please. Great. So thank you again, and thanks to Graham Nixon at the New York Studio School for inviting us to be part of your evening lecture series. I want to extend my gratitude to my fellow discussants this evening, Adrienne Childs and Naudline Pierre. I also want to express appreciation to the Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts for their generous support of this exhibition and its national tour. I want to first acknowledge the Colby College Museum of Art's presence on unceded Wabanaki land. We at the museum express our respect to the Indigenous communities who have lived on these ancestral lands for almost 15,000 years, and to future generations. We recognize the legacies of settler colonialism and make a commitment to building relationships with the Maliseet, Mi'kmaq, Passamaquoddy, Penobscot, and Abenaki peoples. Next slide, please. The more time I spend with Bob Thompson's work, the more questions I accumulate. His visions of martyrdom and hedonistic ferment are shot through with ambiguity. I can find it difficult to take in many of his paintings and wonder if that's the intent. His work confronts history, roots itself in the present, and anticipates futurity, as we'll hear this evening. As his close friend Hetty Jones noted, what Bob had seen and painted was us. So what follows are some curatorial notes on Thompson. I would call it something like unfinished business. Next slide, please. This exhibition originated with a question: why isn't Bob Thompson better known? I was familiar with the catalog from the Whitney Museum of American Art's monumental exhibition in 1998. It was the only monograph on the artist until now. The Colby Museum is fortunate to have 5 works by him in the collection, all gifted by an artist, Alex Katz. Artists never forgot Bob Thompson and what he represents: the freedom of painting for oneself. Next slide, please. The title of this exhibition speaks to the artist's extraordinary ambition and is drawn from a small painting he made in 1960, a transitional year. It's the only title to invoke the first-person voice. I take it as a pronouncement akin to the sentiments of writer James Baldwin, who also sought refuge in Europe. In his 1964 essay, Why I Stopped Hating Shakespeare, Baldwin wrote, "My quarrel with the English language has been that the language reflected none of my experience. Perhaps the language was not my own because I had never attempted to use it, had only learned to imitate it. If this were so, then it might be made to bear the burden of my experience if I could find the stamina to challenge it and me to such a test." Next slide, please. Like Baldwin, Thompson found ways to use painting to challenge its avowed universality by forcing it to bear other subjectivities. Next slide, please. For those who may not know, Bob Thompson was born into a middle-class Black family in Louisville, Kentucky in 1937. He was the youngest of 3 children. His mother worked as a teacher and his father operated a dry cleaning business until he was killed in an accident in 1950. Thompson briefly studied medicine at Boston University before enrolling in the studio program at the University of Louisville, which had desegregated in 1951. Through the university, he was given the opportunity to spend the summer of 1958 in Provincetown, where he continued his training. By 1959, he settled in New York City, where he joined artists like Red Grooms in some of the first happenings. A devotee of jazz, Thompson frequented downtown clubs such as Slug Saloon and the Five Spot. In a letter to one of his sisters, he described the profound impact of his move to New York. I have found, let us say, another part of myself, which can only be for me. Here he's not shown paused in the act of painting, but still he doesn't meet our gaze. He's seated, shirtless, and the daubs of green on his knuckles render the paintings we see around him an extension of himself. In 1961, Thompson and his wife, Carol Plenda Thompson, made their first trip to Europe, passing through London, settling in Paris, and eventually finding their way to Ibiza. Overseas, he was able to immerse himself in the traditions that formed the core of his practice. On their second trip overseas in 1965, the couple settled in Rome. There, Thompson died of a pulmonary edema on May 30th, 1966, after complications following gallbladder surgery, which was likely brought on by his history of substance abuse. Next slide, please. This show covers only 8 years of work produced between 1958 and 1966, demonstrating how early on some of his enduring preoccupations materialized, but also how fitful his impulses remained. Man in Hat isolates the featureless silhouette used by the artist across his oeuvre. The hat is an accessory that was associated with him, but culturally with Lester Young, the jazz saxophonist who died in 1959. Thompson made a statement when he wore it. This character is tremendously elusive, and perhaps even an instance of Thompson's misdirection, according to one 1960 Art News review. A figure with a hat is seen from the rear. It is completely black, dropped into the landscape like a paper silhouette. It is a spectator. Perhaps it is Buster Keaton, or a huntsman, or a deputy sheriff, or the artist's suggestion. It is Lester Young, the jazz musician. Another 1969 critic referred to his cast of characters as his, quote, private mythological subjects, an effective way to capture their simultaneous familiarity and unavailability. Next slide, please. Red Cross is one of small set of oils executed on shaped panels between 1959 and 1963. These fantastically modern objects wink at devotional painting. Here Thompson rhymes the shape of the board with the cross depicted within it, disconcertingly heightening the sense of tactility by gouging deep grooves into the support. Christian iconography merges the experiences of beholding and sanction, two themes that cut across Thompson's work. Here we see the composition as if from over the shoulders of these two onlookers in the foreground. At center, a figure swings from the arm of the cross. It's an unconventional twist on a crucifixion or deposition. According to Thompson, quote, painting should be like the theater, a presentation of something, some activity. Next slide, please. He exploited the immediacy of color and gesture, pushing back against expectations of legibility as he generated friction between the operations of representation and abstraction. He resisted description. As he said, my whole problem is trying to convey without the detail. Here we have a painting that merges a panoply of references into a mesmerizing adoration. Rippling with meanders, the tree trunks relay the dappled light and shadow of a forest interior and thoroughly scramble the image. Next slide, please. What I relish most are these moments of plastic instability and ineffability. He generates tremendous energy from elision and dualism. At right, the cascading hair of a figure reads as the head of one of the creatures, that haunt his canvases. Jazz aesthetics guide the interpretive literature on Thompson, but this exhibition also draws out the poetics in his work. 2 unpublished poems written for the artist are featured in the catalog, one by A.B. Spellman, also in the exhibition, and the other by then Leroy Jones. Next slide, please. Thompson's many citations can be explicit, but also refracted and layered. We'll hear more about this. He makes us question received iconographies, demonstrating how accustomed we've become to their assumptions, absurdities, excesses, and casual barbarism. As the artist Frank Bowling wrote in 1969, we had to wait for a Bob Thompson to understand more clearly. Here, he insinuates himself into foundational art historical narratives and approaches them with a heretical reverence. What realism have we inherited from these representations, he seems to ask. He pokes and pulls away the veil of allegory. Thompson produced countless variations on many of his subjects. There are at least 3 works taking their lead from this Titian. He relies upon touch rather than tool for scenes of restraint or conflict. Here he humorously teases out the beckoning arabesque qualities of the unchained Andromeda's pose and disarms Perseus, who plunges into the mouth of the sea monster. Next slide, please. Portrait of Allen offers an affectionate look at one of the many artists, writers, and musicians with whom Thompson associated. This small portrait depicts Allen Ginsberg, who recalled first meeting the artist in 1958. 2 years earlier, Ginsberg had published Howl, a poem that became emblematic of 1950s countercultural movements. A plea for self-expression, sexual freedom, and tolerance, Ginsberg's poem conjoins the low and the high in its depiction of a tormented generation, quote, who fell on their knees in hopeless cathedrals, praying for each other's salvation. Next slide, please. I love all things that look the way I feel, Thompson was quoted as saying in 1959. There are many moments in the exhibition where one sees him motivating an idea as far and as fast as it will go. Do these extremes or outliers in any way prefigure what might have followed? Ornette is a radial constellation of trees, stumps, and bathers. They orbit an amalgam of mask-like visages just off-center. Uncharacteristically, its palette is dominated by colors we're conditioned to associate with flesh tones. The painting dates to the year of Ornette Coleman's controversial album, Free Jazz, a collective improvisation, which gave its name to the new movement. As one music critic wrote, it does not break with jazz tradition, rather it restores to currency an element that has been absent. The same might be said of Thompson's corrective continuity. So successful is its centrifugal evocation of atmospheric sound that Ornette threatens to disintegrate. So with that, I think I'm going to turn things over to Adrienne, and then we'll jump into discussion later.
Well, thank you very much, Diana. Thank you, Samuel. It's a pleasure to be here with you all and Naudline, and also thank you to the New York Studio School. So a lot of us want to talk about Thompson in all the ways that he was exceptional. He was an outlier. He was a seer, a visionary. But the traditional old-fashioned art historian in me wants to think about the ways he actually fit in. What energies did he tap into? What movements helped to move him along? Because it's very unusual for somebody to be really out there out there all alone. And what might it mean for a Black man in the 1960s, which was supposed to be a transitional phase in race relations? I'm not too sure now, but what might it mean for this Black man to take on a bastion of white elite culture, the European master artist? So how do we fit him in? So it doesn't take long to put him into the context of artists like Larry Rivers, who was a friend of his, who began poking back at the master narratives of art history. And I'm not the one who made that discovery. Others have written about that as well. But Larry Rivers wasn't doing anything new either. Picasso was obsessively revisited Luncheon on the Grass and Women of Algiers as late as the 50s and 60s. In 1957, 15 of Picasso's riffs on Delacroix's Women of Algiers were on display at MoMA. So these kinds of sort of reflections and refractions were very much alive during that time. So when I think about Thompson's sort of passionate repartee with the masters, I wonder how it differs, or it might differ, from Picasso or Rivers. I think there's no getting around the fact that Rivers and Picasso and others of his ilk are dismantling or perhaps worshiping the tradition from within as insiders. These are white men who were the beneficiaries of this Western art tradition. And as a Black American from the Civil Rights era South, Thompson is kind of like an outsider, real or perceived. Now, we can argue about whether or not that matters or should matter. It certainly shouldn't. But the fact of the matter was there were a lot of barriers, boundaries that are caught up in being a Black man in 50s and 60s America. So when you look at his real dedication to European art, or when I looked at it, I thought to myself, what attracts him to these works? And I know that they're attractive and interesting works, but why does he not just create his own compositions? Because he really does dedicate quite a lot of his output to this reframing of the European canon. Is he critiquing them? Is he critiquing art? Is he critiquing his own society, when I would say his own culture, his own friendship, his own milieu? Is he reflecting on something about himself through these compositions? Now, his absorption of Goya has been much remarked upon. And of course, Goya's dark tendencies seem to dovetail with Thompson's. And so it seems like a really good match here, right? So Thompson borrows from lots of different kind of images of Goya's here, like his winged creatures, and assembles them into these kinds of enigmatic compositions that are notoriously difficult to read, but they're endlessly compelling. So how do we read them? We might just have to feel them if we don't want to tether them to the source material. Might just take them as they are. And often the only narrative thread we have to hold on to, should we want to hold on to any narrative thread, is the source material. But then where do these things break down? And how much of that should we be trying to link our interpretation to when he twists and turns at every square inch? And of course, I've lots of these questions, and I will answer none of them, just to let you know. So one of the things that I think he might need in general is structure, or a composition or a story to ground himself in. He often talked about really liking the structure of Poussin, who was a classical Baroque, artist. So thinking about something to center the initial work in, and then from there he can take off in any direction that he wants. I mean, this is what the practical part of me is thinking. Well, maybe in addition to just being interested and intrigued by these works, they provide something, a hook from where you start and something to deviate from. And that's, of course, exactly what he does. I was thinking about what Thompson was doing with the art historical canon in 1963 and what Warhol was doing in 1963. Very different things. Warhol is brandishing the commodity of canonicity, the fame and canonicity and fame, and its endless sort of reproductivity. And he's certainly irreverent. But Thompson remains in a more productive relationship, I think. I mean, in spite of the liberties he takes, the turns, the mysterious beings who seem to be interlopers into this already established action, I think there remains a certain amount of reverence, and maybe we should talk about this with the group later. So why does he not seem to want to rip this material to shreds? The tyranny of art history, I like to call it, that some Black artists will take on as the years go on. Why does his book, so does his Blackness keep him from going on the all-out offensive, like we will see with other artists in later years? Is there, you know, is there that kind of question about grounding, or do you have the footing to destroy something that is not yours in the first place? And that's a question that I think, of course, he did, but it's an interesting question. And in some ways, I think he just really likes European art, and I really liked European art in many ways when I started studying it. But it was in the beginning to me very mysterious. And it's actually, when you think about a lot of these images, if you haven't really studied them, they're opaque, they're strange, they're violent, as Diana said, and they're bizarre. So there's something like very compelling about his just taking that bizarreness of this particularly Baroque painting and just taking it to the next level. So from the Baroque, he seems to translate not only the composition, but the Baroque drama, the movement, the sensuality, the emotion, the religiosity of it. And in some ways, if you really look at Poussin's Mars and Venus, the bizarreness of the little cherubs flying around when they're having sex. I mean, it's, you know, at this, these are courtly images, right? This is what would have been involved. The audience would have been sort of these aristocrats in Baroque courts, European courts. And so Thompson takes it out of that and brings it to, you know, his own group. From the Fauves, he takes the chromatic assertiveness and saturation and applies it to these sort of utopian psychedelic landscapes where color frees us from so many restrictions. Color is also racially indeterminate in these bodies. Look at Nina Simone, who's pink, or what do you call that color? Orchid. And I didn't bring this out in my essay that I wrote for the catalog, but in the 1960s, when he's doing this, it is the time of psychedelic art, you know, public culture, and it's driven by this kind of counterculture. So why don't we think about him in terms of what is going on around him? The psychedelic art, and it's a drug and a music scene as well. Was he involved in the rock, you know, music scene that was closely aligned with the psychedelic movement? So, you know, there's a lot of questions there as well in my mind. So in terms of other Black artists who were engaging with the Western canon around this time, Colescott and Bearden were actually dealing with this material before Thompson. But I think we can conclude that none of them knew each other or knew about each other. So they were operating in a vacuum, but they're again in the bigger context of artists who were dealing with art, postmodern, if you will. When Colescott found out about Thompson, it was a revelation to him, of course. But they're doing very different things. Colescott is really in a power struggle with Matisse and Picasso, wanting to dominate them. He's mining racial taboos, myths, and stereotypes through these different conversations with these artists from the past. But he, I think, kind of is right on their level when it comes to exploiting certain aspects of female bodies. Now, Bearden, on the other hand, is nourished by European art and uses it to tell his epic stories of Black life in America. I don't see that power struggle as much in Bearden. So these are some thoughts that I have, and I'm going to open it back up to the group so that we can start to think about how these ideas might further our conversation and bring in Naudline.
Sam, I wonder if we could put the first slide up as we do that after the break in the slideshow. Thanks. Yeah. Great. Well, you gave us a lot of questions, Adrienne. And Naudline, I'm eager to bring you in, since this is an artist you've also been thinking about and looking at and sort of mining in different ways for some time. So I think it's an opportunity to think about your work and consider ways it can really sharpen some of our understanding of Thompson. So I don't know if there was anything you wanted to respond to off the bat, or.
I mean, there's so much that's been shared. I think it'll all come up while we talk.
Well, Adrienne, you in the catalog, you thought of Bearden and Colescott and Thompson there, and that one image you showed, the Colescott that was up, had him sort of poised between Matisse's nude and his nude, and I think he's always allegoricizing his own relationship to painterly traditions. So I wonder if you had given that more thought, just in terms of his being a foil to Thompson.
Well, he does assertively include himself in his work, even if he included himself a self-portrait there, but you always read him loud and clear, I think, in ways that you don't read. I'm unable to read Thompson in terms of where the critique may begin and where and I don't know. And so with Colescott, he is personally in a competition with these artists, and he says it. He says, "I'm here to take them down," in so many words. And so that to me is totally different than the way Thompson. I feel like he really has an admiration for these artists, and even though he's invading their space, I don't see it as a complete critique. So what do you think? And maybe Naudline can, because I don't know whether, are you critiquing these sources, Naudline?
I think in my practice, I feel really connected to Thompson because I'm approaching it from a lot of different ways. Yes, ultimately there is a critique. There's like me wanting to insert myself in something that feels really exclusionary, but I'm also just like taking images and remixing them for my own use, and also making them into things that I want to see and enjoy. So I think it depends on my mood, really. But I think, as with Thompson's work, there are many different ways to enter and kind of understand. But at the end of the day, I'm looking at these artworks and mining a lot of beautiful passages and a lot of ideas. And I think it's a mix.
Mm-hmm. I see your work on the left, Lead Me Gently Home. I feel welcome into your canvases. I feel like they want me to understand and to be nourished. I don't feel like I know what's welcome into his Thompson's canvases. I feel like it's like a play happening, and I just have to sit back and see it play out.
Yeah, I think there's Diana, we were talking about this idea of tenderness in my work, but also trying to find those areas in Thompson's work where we see touch, but it's a different kind of touch. I think my work is more overtly tender, You can kind of get that, like you're saying, Adrienne, these like welcoming images. But I also I like to kind of explore multiplicity. Like in these images, it can be really warm and welcoming, but also there may be moments where something is a little bit more ambiguous, or maybe leans towards a little bit malicious, or maybe you just can't tell, which with Thompson's work, I think it's a little bit more overt. But yeah, there's touch. I think that goes through both. I think we look at these two images, there's touch there. But it's a different kind of touch.
Well, I think just looking even at this juxtaposition, I think Adrienne, I would second your point. And, part of what one sees as welcoming is how oriented the composition is and the figures are towards us as viewers. And, I think of Thompson's work being so, getting its charge from being so introverted. So, the featurelessness of the figures is part of that. But what is legible sort of at any distance in both your work is really gesture. And I think that's one of the things that he keys into in his citations, and he kind of re-articulates with great sensitivity, sometimes exaggerating, sometimes with nuance. And so I think that for me comes across here in both of these. I wonder, we can move on from Colescott, but one thing that he did when he reflected on Thompson's work, he wrote in 1989, "How can painting so brilliant, high key, and lush be tragic? Or can an artwork make you laugh and cry as well?" And I wonder if that is a reading that rings true for both of you, if that's a tension that you perceive.
For me, yes. I think there's so much humor in what I've seen, especially I think of the painting after Poussin with, it's not here, but I think we'll get to it in the slides, but in Poussin's work, it's some grapes, but then Thompson reimagines those grapes as the backside of someone kind of poking out and being carried across. And I think, yeah, that's funny, but it's also kind of sad and terrifying as well. And I think that's the beauty of the work, is that it can kind of make you feel a lot of different things. It can dig into a lot of different areas. And I kind of think the humor and the tragedy, they go hand in hand, not only in his work, but I mean, in life, really.
I think that it's also this place of the condition of kind of both and it refuses that sort of binary system. I appreciate that in the work. I think this permission to claim a kind of dynamic multivalence for yourself, particularly as a representational painter. It's something that's been said of your work, I think beautifully, Naudline. I was, looking at something Legacy Russell had written, and she said, "The right to mourn and celebrate simultaneously, standing in that crossroads brings tears, a divine vessel in release." And I don't know, maybe now would just be a moment to say when you also first encountered Thompson's work, because we talked a little bit about that.
Yes, I first encountered Thompson's work early on in grad school. I had a studio visit. I don't remember with who. It was kind of like a passing visit. And this person was like, you should check out Bob Thompson's work, because they saw that I was kind of, I had some challenges with some of this like European canon, and I felt drawn to it and also repulsed. And it was just kind of like a really difficult time for me. And then I found Thompson's work, and I was like, wait a minute, someone's been there before me. Like I felt like we were kindred spirits in a way. And I felt really encouraged to kind of break some of the rules while still like standing firm in what I want to see in the images, and kind of take things and have that agency and power, and just reimagine something in a way that felt inclusive to me in my existence.
And we put up we'll have a few images of your work in here, sometimes alongside one of Thompson's. I don't know if you want to say anything in particular about this piece.
Sure. I think when I saw, when we were together at Colby looking at the work, I was really drawn to some of these smaller paintings on panels and how intimate that experience. You could, yes, with a larger painting, you can feel the gesture, you can feel emotion, but with these smaller paintings, they're almost tool-like and really special, and the scraping and the layering of paint on that different surface. So this is a work that I did 2019 kind of through 2020. And it was kind of my first time working with this many figures in such a small space. And so thinking about Thompson's work and how those smaller works are so charged and packed, it just made me think about this work and how maybe they're in conversation with each other. And of course, you'll always find wings in my work. And I feel like it's the same with Thompson. And I think that's like an obvious connection. For me, it's this idea of escape through imagination and possibility. And maybe there's some of that in his work as well. But with this particular work, I wanted to include it because of those really intimate small paintings, especially the painting, This House Is Mine.
And this is a great, I know, which I don't have an image of, but is the painting from which the show took its title, and is very small, similarly sized actually to this. I just wanted to revisit that idea of care, because I think that's such an important term in your work, and we see it, we feel it importantly, and by implication, I was thinking about some of Adrienne's points about the dark undercurrents in Thompson's work, the ways that he sort of secularizes sacred violence and exposes the ritualistic nature of cultural violence. Actually, I think we could stay on Naudline's for a moment. So I guess in looking at these, I wonder by implication, if care is important, does it mean that violence exists within your protagonist's world? And what does that look like?
Yeah, I would have to say yes. I think light exists because dark, you can't understand that you're experiencing light unless you've experienced dark. So I think in this world, there are moments where they feel really light and loving and special and tender, but then there are also moments that maybe feel less so. And if you look closely, some of those moments are kind of hidden in these compositions. Especially, I think there's this kind of a loneliness that happens. These figures are all together and you can see that they're experiencing things together, but then you can also kind of check where their gaze is kind of going, and very rarely are they looking at each other. So they're kind of experiencing a little bit of loss, a little bit of loneliness, even though this is kind of a really tender and soft composition or arrangement of bodies.
I really love this painting, and I see this as a universe of its own, as opposed to Thompson's, generating his universes, starting with another composition. It's really hard to abandon those other compositions completely. So I see you creating this universe of your own completely. And now this might be an insulting question to ask an artist, but I'm going to do, and all the artists in the audience are going to go, oh, but Are any of these self-portraits or self-referential, the faces?
I think with this work, I'm exploring a protagonist that I have in the past felt was an alter ego, but in getting to know her more, I'm realizing she's an entity that exists and experiences a whole other life in what I think is a parallel universe or universes. I think anytime there's a painter painting figures, you're inserting yourself in some way, whether it's literal or not. But specific to my work, I don't see them as self-portraits, but anything that I'm absorbing, whether it's someone else's experience or someone else's, likeness or my own, I think does end up in the work, but technically speaking, no, not self-portraits.
Maybe if we could have the next slide, Sam, thanks. That makes me wonder a couple of things, but you talk about world building. We've been talking about your world, and so I guess I wonder, what are some of the things that there are left to say about the world that Thompson creates? You have a painting here, The Judgment, that's in the Brooklyn Museum collection, and one that's really catalytic within an incredible curriculum that they've developed as part of a diversion program with Project Reset. A conversation starting from a place of who judges whom. And so I wonder, what is this world? What are the things we know? What are the constants? What are the things that are mutable? Do we see the artist appearing within it? And maybe not in this painting, but anywhere?
What if you have to narrow that question down?
I'll give us something. I think that, and you've said this, Diana, but I think the most interesting thing about this world that Thompson is expanding on or creating or whatever is that it's both familiar and unfamiliar. And I think that is what keeps drawing us into this work. Yes, it's kind of based on things we've seen, or the landscapes are you can kind of place a horizon or some sort of orientation. Not in all the works, but in a lot. And I think when I think of Thompson's world, I kind of think of looking at this world, but maybe you have, different goggles on, and it kind of inverts the colors and you can kind of see it in a different way. It doesn't feel like it's a completely different world, is what I'm trying to say. There's still that sense of the familiar here.
Mm-hmm. Someone has compared him to Hieronymus Bosch, before, and I think that's a good comparison. Just the familiar but totally bizarre, I guess, is the world that. But after you look at the pieces so much that you become very familiar. You become familiar with the icons like the birds. And you wonder whether they all have the same kind of meaning, or are they meaningless in they're all in the same way, you see. So I tend to think of this as part of a whole. And I also think about the fact that he did these over a very short period of time. His life was cut short. And I think it would be a lot easier to understand this had he had more time to continue. And then we would have a lot better idea about where this universe would go, if that makes any sense. But it is what it is in terms of the map. But he was very prolific, so I'll have to say that helps. That's all I have to say about it. But one thing I will say is that when very strange figures come in, even stranger, like this little figure here sitting on the blackbird, the darker pink with the eyes looking out, and that it seems like almost an extemporaneous little, kind of humorous thing to add. No arms there. It seems like sometimes these things are just very improvisational. And we're going to try to figure out something that was not really figured out to begin with. And so we're, as art historians, we try to read in a lot that we might just want to sit back and absorb.
I think that's right. And maybe if we could advance to the next slide, we have another instance of one of your paintings. And then thinking about light was what brought me here. So if we could go one more. Since this was a moment when you visited Naudline that we sort of lingered, and I think it's a fascinating composition. You know, particularly, you don't often sort of see distinctions made between exterior and interior in the work. And it's a rendition of the abduction of Helen of Troy with variations on this, new variations, because they're sort of infinite iterations of these creatures, but these bird-headed forms and this very amoebic one at left with these sort of hooked appendages and a kind of elaborate choreography that almost feels balletic between the figures in the middle. And so you stopped me when you, because you were thinking about light in relationship to this painting.
Yes, I think light is something I'm always thinking about, especially when you're building worlds. It's like, where does the light come from? Like that can determine so much. But with this particular painting, it kind of stopped me because, like you said, we have this entrance to a sort of cave. But then we have the outside of this mound or whatever, this kind of earthen structure. And there's this really bright yellow and orange, almost as if there's some sort of a spotlight kind of going towards these characters in the center of the painting. And then you have this blue within the cave that to me feels like when light leaks into a dark area, you kind of get those kind of murky blues. So this kind of caught me off guard. I don't feel like I've seen anything like this, or maybe I haven't noticed it, but there's a little bit of, it might just be wet paint mixing together, but I interpreted it as like a little bit of a shadow, like a cast shadow behind this figure with the green wing holding this other figure. So for me, it was like a very overt sense of light and dark. And it just made things kind of stand out a little bit more three-dimensionally when we're kind of used to some of this flattening of the form with Thompson's work. So yeah, I don't know, it kind of caught me off guard, and I just couldn't stop looking and trying to figure out what the logic was there. But it just reads to me like he wants us to look into the center of the painting.
And I'm going to keep us moving just to keep us on schedule. But this was another really wonderful moment in the show. I think he's working within but against historically specific devotional forms. And, you know, what I appreciate here is that he kind of restages this sort of encounter, kind of intimate encounter, while on one side, the imagery becomes more generalized. He generalizes a moment of human connection. And I think, you know, thematizes attention. And that's another term that I think about a lot. But it also is one of my favorite color stories in Thompson. So if we go to the next slide, we'll see that this is also a kind of space that your work has moved into on occasion. And so I wonder if you could say something about what it means to be working, you know, within a form like this.
Yeah, that double-sided panel piece like really took my breath away when I saw it in person. And what I love about it is that it's kind of disrupting the space, because you have to reorient your body to kind of really take it in. And I feel that, and also the shape of it is kind of like in a cross, like kind of cut out like a cross. So I enjoy Thompson kind of taking, like you said, like a very traditional kind of substrate or way to paint and like remixing it. And so here I have, I guess, my take on an altarpiece, where you have to orient your body in order to kind of see the outside wings and kind of see and experience the work, and it kind of disrupts the space three-dimensionally, even though like the actual work is two-dimensional. Yeah, I think taking from like kind of religious iconography, all of that, I see it as a tool, just like foreground, middle ground, background, just like texture. It's all just things there waiting for me to take and use. And I feel that there's power there, there's agency there to take and use the way that I want to.
I just realized that both of these are in the same collection, incredibly. So the master is very lucky to have them both. How do you feel about that installation? Because I also think, you know, I think of things you've said when I think about Thompson and some of the cautions that Adrienne has made, but you said in a talk recently, I don't want to be explained away through the lens of those who've come before. And so I wonder how you feel in these moments of where you're installed in the company of those who've come before.
Yeah, I feel like it's an opportunity to be part of a conversation. I want to be seen and kind of taken in with these works, but not justified because of them, or I want to be able to be all of the things I want to be and not kind of pigeonholed, but still have a foot in maybe a European collection, but maybe have another foot in this, you know, science fiction context or whatever. Like I want to be multiples. And I see freedom in that. So being in a context like this, yeah, great, I'm thrilled. The one thing I don't want is that I exist because of, I want to stand in my power and be alongside of those who came before, as opposed to they are the reason why I'm here, you know?
And I think if we go one more, we have another comparison. And one that really brings forward some of those questions about tenderness and protection and how they're operative in your work, and maybe the ways that touch functions in Thompson's. And, you know, I think here, of course, we see striking differences. You know, I noticed the way that you really persuasively signal the weight of the central figure. And in contrast, how unnaturally weightless his bodies can be. And, you know, the cross is absent. That's often the case in his depositions. I feel like it gets displaced. It's sort of sublimated into other pastoral scenes where trees completely disrupt something, some placid scene. But these moments of collectivity bring out a lot of the distinctions, the ways that your work is really doing very different things.
Yeah, I think what you said about the weight of the body, it makes a lot of sense to me. But I actually feel like this deposition on the left, its weightlessness makes me interpret it as tender. And kind of the flatness of the form, these figures kind of standing around. To me, I see tenderness there, but I'm looking for that everywhere anyway. And I think out of a lot of his compositions, this one feels a little bit like less, I guess, violent. Like I don't sense that violence there, even though we have some of these forms that are kind of in the background, kind of in the shadows over there by the trees. But I think there is care there. But I'm also just, yeah, like I said, I'm also just always looking for care. But I think some similarities, this is around when I was like thinking about Thompson, like a lot. I made this painting in grad school, and this darker figure that's kind of supporting the weight of the central figure is very flat. There isn't much there. And I think I was really playing with like this idea of like a cut and paste, like just cutting out a figure and placing it into the composition, and allowing the imagination to fill in the gaps in terms of form. which I think happens in his work.
I think we have just a couple more slides, which I feel if folks want to, we could just cruise through. And if anyone wants to add anything, I mean, there were just a few other instances here of, I think touch and sort of the way that he also transforms touch. I was thinking of the way that often connection looks more like a near miss in Thompson's work. And here, his rendition of the Tintoretto seems almost to rationalize for me the chaos of the original, which is an interesting position. I don't know if others have thoughts, or we could just keep going before we take questions.
Yeah, we should probably keep going. We've already gone on. It's already after 7:30.
So I think my last question then for both of you before we turn it over would just be, why do you think he is not better known? Why? I mean, we may have answered this with our many questions, but why is this someone who, who people are still discovering, coming to?
Well, we have to think about, how do artists become well-known, particularly artists who are no longer with us, right? No longer working. Is it including them in texts, books, or is it exhibitions? You see, where would an artist of this generation gain that kind of visibility? Probably through exhibitions in some ways, but again, maybe it was the in-betweenness of him being a Black artist and doing this very unusual work at the time, didn't fit into the narratives as those of us who were writing the stories of African American art. He's always included, but perhaps we overlooked, or those overlooked, some of the contributions because of the difficulty to read the work when the Black African American art canon was being developed in the 1970s, which was still very soon after he passed away. But I always knew about him once I started studying the art history of African American art. So I didn't even realize how little he was known to others. Yeah, there are a lot of African American artists of this generation who are still underappreciated.
I think there are so many reasons. We could go on and on about why this is, but I do think that the opaqueness of the work, the opacity, I think that had something to do with it, of course. When you think about race and what that meant for him in that time, the way that he's making these figures, and maybe, he's using all these colors, and it's not so on the nose in terms of, you know what I mean? So,
Yeah.
So I think there were many reasons why I think he's lesser known, but I'm really happy that he's kind of getting that support now. And I think because figuratism is so, it's so in the moment now, and especially breaking rules and kind of breaking the form. And so I think I'm happy that he's getting his flowers now.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's a good time to turn to questions, Sam.
Give an applaud. I hope you can hear. Thank you, everybody. That was really rich, and I'm hoping, audience, please do put some questions in at the bottom of your screen. You see the Q&A button down there, or you can put them in the chat as well, and I'll try and get to them. And I just feel like personally that Bob Thompson's such a painter's painter. He's kind of hard to access in that way. but painters discover him and it's a revelation for, so interesting. There's a question here from an anonymous person. They're asking, the owl bird image appears in many of Thompson's works. What does it represent? Is it something generic or specific? Is it more specific?
Well, I don't have an answer to anything, so I will answer it with my non-answers. But I think that it's part of his own mythology. I don't know whether we know, maybe you do know what the bird means, but I feel like those birds are almost like the same birds who fly in and out of the scenes in the compositions. I mean, they're just mythic beings that often make an appearance, and they're his sort of personal iconography. That we just might not know exactly what they mean. And also birds are mythic creatures and mysterious creatures. And I think he's definitely playing on that. What do you think?
I agree. I also feel like, I think we had a kind of a note on privacy. I think that maybe there are things in the work that he wouldn't have wanted to explain. Like maybe there are things for him to kind of place himself in the work. To kind of conceal himself in the work, and maybe some of these areas in the painting are just for him. And I like that. I like this idea of mystery. Like maybe that wasn't meant for me to understand or for him to understand.
Yeah, and they're witnesses. Oh, I'm sorry. I just like the idea of them being witnesses as well. But anyway, go ahead.
No, I was just going to add that he speaks so glibly about the birds that I distrust them for all the things he ascribes to them. They're being sort of symbolic of freedom and things. I think he does, from Goya, there's kind of the harpy, the human bird, who is in many cases, sort of satirically specific in Goya. And so I kind of think that where he places the birds in these compositions, it also inevitably reveals a sort of moment of transformation, right? The bird has emerged from a piece of drapery, from a wedge of shadow. And so it also calls attention to itself in this way that I distrust. I guess the birds take on incredible amounts of significance when, to Adrienne's point about meaninglessness, I begin to ask if there are some things that have less meaning or meaning that is so thoroughly unavailable that it may as well be meaningless.
I say that.
That's interesting. This is Sarah's asking a very related question about, she's curious to learn more about the figures in Naudline's and Thompson's work. And maybe Naudline, you could speak more about the tension between archetypal imagery versus individuality expression shown here. I think this conversation on this idea of universe is interesting. Thank you.
Okay, can you repackage that question into a question?
I think they are, Sarah, if you want to type it back in, please do, but just learning more about, speak more about the tension between archetypal imagery versus your individual expression. So, I mean, I think that maybe goes back to what you were saying about the sort of self-portrait question from Adrienne.
Okay.
But maybe just unpack that a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, I think in making the work, like I said before, there's a lot that's absorbed and then just kind of intentionally and also unintentionally placed back into the work. And that can be picking from work that's been done before, obviously, like like Thompson, kind of looking at other artists, like a bunch of dead Italians maybe, and taking from that work and having it be a more literal representation in the work. But for me, the agency is in breaking it so much that it becomes my own. And that's where I see the individuality. It's like, that's where I see, okay, I'm creating my own mythology. I'm creating my own worlds. And I feel that maybe that's the difference between our work, is that I'm not interested in reimagining what I see here. I just want something completely new. I want something away from here, and not a here, but an elsewhere. Yeah.
Mm.
Okay. Sorry. I have this is an anonymous question. Do we know much about his drawings? We didn't really cover this part in the talk.
Sure, we didn't show any, but there are a number represented in the exhibition, and there's a wonderful essay in the book by the scholar Jacqueline Francis about Thompson's drawing practice. And again, I think it's one that is fascinating you can appreciate his command of line in another way. And many of these are portraits. So, in distinction, he's drawing in jazz clubs. He's drawing all of the people in his life. And so there is a kind of immediacy to many of these. So I would encourage folks to look at those. It was not really a focus of the show as much, because there was just so much to bring together in the paintings. And, we had about 83 works in the show. So I would have liked to do more with drawings. Also, the pandemic prevented me from getting to them. Yeah, it's a great question. There's definitely more to do looking at them together as well.
And I'll just also say that he draws on canvas, and you can often see the pencil marks of the drawing on the canvas through the paint. They're often not covered. So I don't know what that means, but it's definitely intentional, right?
And he draws over reproductions too. So he's really there are a lot of instances where he's sort of drawing in gouache over a reproduction or a text, sort of drawing also on kind of found materials as well. And that, that when he is drawing those erasures, the sense, it's very intentional that everything is kind of coming through.
Yeah, it's a way of distinguishing yourself from the old master tradition of painting, and not having any traces of that. They are sort of the modernist, I guess, but intervention. But again, I'm still feeling like there's something about those original works that he's still paying homage to, even though he's using color and form in ways that were irreverent in the modernist sense.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the gouache works, because in the exhibition there are a lot of prep drawings, or I call them drawings, they're paintings, and there is a work that's on like recycled paper, so there's text you can read through, and some of those works just feel really immediate. I mean, the paintings, you can sense the immediacy as well, but in those smaller prep drawings, you can really, really see it. And so I kind of feel like drawing is a huge part of all of the work. And if you look closely, like you said, Adrienne, you can see the drawing, not only with the outlines, but just like in the way that he's leaving some of those edges, those darker edges, or like meeting two colors, and then the color in between is kind of framing a nose or an eye. To me, that's drawing as well.
Hmm.
All right. Maybe time for a couple more questions, if that's good for everyone. I mean, this discussion is really interesting, so I'm happy to go on, but just want to be mindful of everyone's time. This question is from Alana. They're asking, they say, thank you for this presentation, very interesting. I just wanted to follow up on the comparison of Thompson with Colescott and Bearden. If Colescott is in a personal power struggle with European artists and Bearden is nourished by them, is Thompson then somewhere in between, or is he doing something different? And does it have something to do with his interest in story and myth? I know this was touched on a bit, but I would love any further thoughts on this, even speculative.
Well, I think it depends on who you ask, right? I'm going to err on the side of him being certainly being nourished by it. I don't see him. I think he sees. Do you see a little bit of irony or in that? But I don't see him as of trying to destroy the tradition from within. Being destructive. So that's why. Yeah. What about you, Diana? I don't know.
I would agree. I think that he's sometimes seeing things that are unrealized in the originals too. And, I think in particular, I don't know how we reproduce in the book a photo of his studio, and on the wall, of course, you have a reproduction of Manet's Olympia and a piece of African sculpture, and sort of, he could not be more of a modernist artist in that respect. So I think it is really, and even in the way that he cultivates this kind of opacity, right? That is a post-impressionist move. That's something that Gauguin owns. So I guess I see it as really, even in the way he self-fashions, he's very deferential.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and he got criticized by at least one commentator and probably more, but who went on the record. I think it was with Stanley Crouch with that. Who was it with Crouch? That anyways, he said that to him that Thompson, the reason Thompson, the white people loved him basically was because he pandered to them through the use of through the in the engagement with European art, and so that's why white. That he was loved by these white collectors. And of course that wasn't fair, but this was what another Black artist said, that he's basically pandering to them. So that got him in trouble with some sectors. You think about the Black arts movement in the 70s and the late 60s, the Black Power movement, Black arts movement. So there was a lot of pressure for people to deal with narratives of social issues, and they saw these as a betrayal of that in some ways. So but I don't think that would have stopped him, and certainly didn't stop him.
I think Alana's, hi Alana, I think also your point about storytelling, that that to me is another thing, that while he will say that the sort of narratives of the works that he gravitates to are irrelevant, I don't believe that. And I think it's part of, even we didn't talk so much about his facture and the ways that he, intentionally really can coarsen and be very crude and sort of naive in the way that he paints. But I think storytelling is similarly something that he kind of flouts taking it on. He sort of likes the unfashionability of the complexity of some of these stories. And so I guess, yeah, maybe one more question.
One more question? Okay. Let me see. Alana says, thank you. This is kind of a specific question, but I think it may expand more on what Adrienne was just talking about. It's kind of long, so bear with me for a moment. One of you mentioned Bob Thompson and Larry Rivers. What was their time of knowing each other? They say, interestingly, Hilton Alls is talking this week at the Menil collection about the Menil's 1971 exhibit, Some American History. which critically was a disaster as it focused on, to an extent, on Rivers' paintings of Blacks, and the several Black artists who showed at the exhibit felt rather left out of the process. But the Menils changed some of their focus to really concentration on Black artists and their role in America. So did they know about Bob Thompson at that point?
Did the
That makes sense.
Dominials know about Bob Thompson at that point?
Yeah, did they know about Bob Thompson and then
In,
the relationship with Larry Rivers?
I don't know what they knew about. I think that the relationship with Larry Rivers was basically in the well, everything was happening in the 60s when he was living in New York in that downtown art scene and the jazz scene. I don't have the exact dates. I think Larry Rivers spoke at his funeral or was a pallbearer or an honorary pallbearer. He was in the archives. His name was in the program. But again, we're talking about a few years relatively to people's lives, you know, from because he died in 66, right? But yeah, in this, I would say from the early 60s until he died in 66. And I don't have a great sense of their relationship.
I don't either, but there is a really beautiful drawing by Rivers of Thompson in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art.
Well, all right. I think that's it. If any of you would like to have a final comment, I want to thank you all on behalf of the New York Studio School, and thank our audience for tuning in tonight for this very special evening. Please do try and see the Bob Thompson show in one of its locations, and Naudline's show as well if you're in Dallas or New Orleans. I hope you can go see her work in person. But thanks again, and have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you all.